Hi, in the last video I gave an introduction to personality through the color model. This time I want to take things a step further and go into personality in more detail and cover personality and its various traits using something which is called the Big Five. So the idea of this video is to help you understand your own personality, but also the personality of others. By having the kind of tools and the knowledge about people's personalities can help you better navigate various life obstacles and come to conclusions and decisions with others in a more reasonable way. That brings me on to the Big Five. So what is the Big Five? Well, the Big Five is kind of accepted across many disciplines, but particularly psychology, in that it helps understand and represent an individual person. So the reason why it's called the Big Five is because it's made up of 5 specific traits, which we'll get into in a minute. But these traits, when looked at individually, form common patterns. And so it's therefore helpful for psychologists and other people in that industry to identify these traits so that they can better understand people's situations and their personalities. So we're going to go into detail with each of the 5 traits, but very quickly they are extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, conscientiousness, and openness to experience. So starting with the obvious one, which is extroversion, it goes back to what I mentioned in a previous video, which is the difference between introverts and extroverts. So like I said in the last video, there's no universally accepted definition of extroversion, but in short, it is social enthusiasm. So another interesting point about extroversion is a lot of people consider it to be the personality domain of positive emotion. So generally, and it's not always the case, but people who are more extroverted tend to be people who find it easier to experience positive emotion because they form excitement in various social situations, whereas introverts need to get their excitement and positive emotion elsewhere. So the next trait is agreeableness, and this is kind of your cooperativeness and social conformity. So people who are highly agreeable tend to follow patterns of behavior and follow the rules very much and offer themselves and their services to other people more easily, and if someone asks them to do something, they tend to adhere to that request. They also tend to be a bit more polite and so on. But like most of the traits, and we're going to cover this in a minute, there is no kind of correct answer. So while it might seem like if you are highly agreeable, that's a better thing, but you'll see that there's pros and cons to being both agreeable and disagreeable. So the thing about agreeableness is there does seem to be an association or correlation with empathy. So people who are more agreeable tend to feel and experience the emotions of others, so therefore it's easier for them to get on board a particular request and so on. So people who are more empathetic tend to see the situations that other people experience, and therefore they're more willing to help out and so on. So the next trait is conscientiousness. So people who are highly conscientious find it very difficult to sit around and do nothing, but particularly if their environment is very sloppy and disorganized. So conscientiousness kind of encapsulates those two things together. So people who are highly conscientious tend to be very orderly, they like things done properly, but also they have that willingness to always move forward and get things done and move on to the next task and so on. So the next trait is neuroticism, and neuroticism is the domain of negative emotion. So people who are more neurotic tend to either experience negative emotion more regularly or they experience it more drastically. So neuroticism encapsulates both of those things. It's the frequency and likelihood of you experiencing things in a negative light, but also how extreme you experience those things. So neuroticism is basically made up of 2 subtraits, which is withdrawal and volatility. So withdrawal is your kind of tendency to avoid in the face of uncertainty. So if there's something you're not sure how it's going to go, you tend to be kind of dissuaded or put off, or kind of afraid or fearful of what could happen. And then volatility is when something actually does happen, how you process and experience that. So people who are more volatile, if something goes wrong, and it doesn't actually matter what that thing is, it could be something really, really minor, or it could be physical pain, or it could be a psychological incident, or it could be traffic or anything. But when something goes wrong, people who are more volatile tend to experience that negative emotion. And that negative emotion could come in the form of anger or sadness or stress and so on. So the last trait is probably the most difficult to conceptualize, but in short, it's whether you are more imaginative and creative or more traditional and conventional. So people who are more open tend to be more creative, but they also get more of their passion through novelty. whereas someone who has low openness or low openness to experience tends to be more conventional in their views and approach to things. So therefore they like structure, they like things to be predictable, and they like things to be bounded. Whereas people who have high openness or high openness to experience tend to like experiencing new things, but also they tend to be more into aesthetics, so art and beauty and so on. And I guess the last kind of sub trait or sub aspect of openness to experience is intellect. And this is an interesting one because when people hear intellect, they often think it's intelligence, but these are two different things. So intellect is your interest and fascination with ideas and concepts, particularly abstract ones, whereas intelligence is your ability to problem solve and recognize patterns and so on. So intelligence is typically measured in the context of an IQ test, whereas intellect is more your willingness to engage with abstract ideas. So the next thing I want to cover is, can you or even should you try and change any of these personality traits? So the reality of it is you can change some of these traits, but it's what I would call semi-malleable, in that these things can change, but it often takes a certain period of time and a certain amount of effort and willingness to do so. So if you have no intention of changing any of these things, they tend not to change, or if they do, it's very slow over a period of time. But if you have a desire to increase or decrease a particular aspect of your personality, if you kind of immerse yourself in certain things, or you read up on certain things, or try to change your beliefs and behavior, then it is possible to change your individual personality traits. So in terms of whether you should try and change them, obviously that is a subjective and personal thing, but it's quite important to realize that with all these traits, there is no good guy and bad guy. So for example, agreeableness, like I alluded to earlier, is nice in that there's an empathetic element, and you're more likely to help others and attend to other people's needs. But equally, if your agreeableness is too high, you tend to get kind of exploited or taken advantage of because you always put yourself out there for others. Whereas someone who's more disagreeable tends to be more independent and go their own way, and they have no problem saying no. But equally, if you're too disagreeable, you're more likely to try and form conflict or get into arguments with people purely because you disagree with them. So maybe it's a bit too simplistic to say, but I kind of consider the people who are extremely high in agreeableness to be the people pleasers. But again, being a people pleaser to a certain extent is good, but being too much of a people pleaser means that you often don't give yourself enough time or cater to your own needs because you're always catering to other people's. So because most people are somewhere in the middle of this curve, like I said, between 25 and 75, you tend not to notice these people as much in each of those traits, whereas you really notice people who are extremely extroverted or extremely introverted. Like the extrovert, always has to be doing something, is always partying or going out or meeting people, whereas the extreme introvert, you barely ever see them because they always need their own time. So coming back to the whole idea of whether you should try and change any of your traits, if you're in either of the extremes, then maybe you can look at things and think, oh, I need to kind of tone or up or down any of those specific areas. So if you are extremely introverted, well, maybe what you need is to find a way of becoming more comfortable with other people. But equally, if you are extremely extroverted, then maybe you need to find a way to enjoy your own time and not need and become as socially reliant as you currently are. So it's the same with all these traits. The extremes are the danger zones. They're not inherently bad, but with any extreme, there's extreme behavior, and a lot of people's kind of issues stem from their extreme beliefs and behaviors. So the last thing I want to cover is how this all relates to the last video, which is the color model. And you may have already kind of noticed or recognized this, but the big five tends to be a lot more discrete and atomic in each of those traits. So each of these things, for the most part, is a kind of a self-contained trait, whereas in the color model, it's sort of like an umbrella for a collection of traits. So to translate one to the other, you might say that red people, or people who are in the kind of red spectrum of the color model, tend to be more conscientious, they tend to be more disagreeable, and to some extent they're more extroverted as well. And it's the same with yellow. They tend to be very high in extroversion and very high in openness to experience, but then more low on the kind of orderly side or lower conscientiousness. Whereas greens tend to be very agreeable and they tend to be less extroverted, and they tend to be lower on the openness to experience spectrum, and so on. So this leaves blues who are higher on the conscientiousness, a little bit lower on the extroversion, and higher on the openness to experience. Neuroticism doesn't really come into these as much. You may argue that people who are red tend to be higher on neuroticism because stereotypically they have a shorter temper or a short fuse, but this isn't necessarily the case. So while the color model is very accessible and digestible, and it's nice and easy to kind of see certain traits in certain people and say, oh, they must be a red or a green and so on, it's not as quite clear cut or as kind of low level in detail as the Big Five. And I'm not implying that the Big Five is particularly complicated, but it is a bit more wordy and academic when compared to the color model. That's it really for this video. I've covered between the two videos now personality in a simpler and a slightly more complicated way. I'm probably going to make more videos in the future on the topic of personality, psychology and behavior, but I think this kind of wraps this one up in terms of the Big Five. So there are other ways of looking at personality as well, and there are definitely loads of websites and systems and tests that you can do to kind of break down and try and understand your personality in more detail. But I think ones that adhere to kind of conventional psychological models tend to be more accurate, but also more understood, because more and more people can kind of understand each of those traits and make sense of them, and then compare your results with other people. And ultimately, personality by themselves doesn't really mean anything, but when your personality is different to someone else, that's where the kind of interesting stats and facts kind of show up. So I hope you found this interesting. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, but that's it for this time, and I'll see you next time.